My name is Jen Pedalston. I'm president of the Chestermere Historical Foundation, and I would like to welcome you here today, January 18th, 2022, to our program called United Farmers of Alberta, Politics of the Early 20th Century. And it is going to be presented by one of our members of the Chestermere Historical Foundation, Kay Clark. And following the program, we hope that you'll join in and ask Kay questions or possibly make comments. We welcome that always on our programs. And our program will be, as I said, recorded, and we do usually put them up onto our website, maybe not right after the program has been done, but within the near future, we will get these all up underneath our program section of our website. So we welcome you to go to the website if you're new to us to check out some of the other programs we have and other materials. Next month, we will have a program on the place names of Chestermere. Following that, in March, a program on the search for the woolly mammoth tooth that was discovered in Chestermere in 1978 and has gone missing. So without any further announcements, go to our website, check us out. And I'd like to welcome Kay to do our program, and she can also tell you a little bit about her family's history here in Chestermere.
Thank you very much, Jen. The Chestermere Historical Foundation acknowledges that this historical program is being delivered on the traditional land of the people of Treaty 7 and the Métis Nation of Alberta. Although I am not a politician, I do have a farming background with 3 generations of my family belonging to the organization that I'm going to talk about, the United Farmers of Alberta, and their foray into politics. Please note that in the time given, I cannot cover this topic in great detail, so you will hear an overview of how farm folks came to be governing the province of Alberta. Some of you may be asking how talking about farmers relates to Chestermere. The fact is that until about 1975, all the permanent residents around Chestermere were farm families, as the lake was merely a recreational destination without permanent residents. Before I talk about politics, I would like to give you a little bit of a background about how the UFA organization came to be. There were several things happening which led to its formation. In 1872, the Canadian government passed the Dominion Lands Act. It required that applicants needed to be male, over 18, or a widowed woman. They needed to reside on the land for at least 3 years, being actually on the land for 6 months of each of those years. They needed to construct a dwelling of a minimum size of 18 by 24 feet. And in this part of the country, many of those 18 by 24 foot buildings became granaries later on. They needed to cultivate a specific number of acres, and they needed to plant some acres. This opened up the West to all kinds of settlement. People from many areas, British Isles, Scandinavian countries, the US, and Europe, came to get land which they had heard was available. This was mainly farmers who were looking for a better life for themselves and their families. So when the Canadian government advertised land for $10 and some other conditions, it was very attractive. This means that the rural population of Alberta was more than double the urban population and continued to be rural right up until the 1940s. Farm families have always faced many related difficulties, but the differences were different. The distances from family and friends and the distance from selling produce was another difficulty. The 12-mile to Calgary was a 3 to 4 hour walk or a 2 to 3 hour horseback ride, which is now a 5-minute drive. One thing that really facilitated development of the West, back up here one more, sorry. One thing that really facilitated development of the West was the breaking plow. At the rate of about 1.5 million acres a year, grassland could be turned into productive grain fields. In 1905, the wheat yield for the first time exceeded 100 million bushel mark. In the next 10 years, the yield increased substantially. All of this grain was funneled into one market, Winnipeg. That meant that every farmer who had a wagon load or a carload of grain had a direct dollars and cents interest in what went on there. In 1883, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed west to Calgary, and just as important, from Winnipeg to Port Arthur, which was a shipping terminal. This opened up a way for the produce to be shipped from the west and really opened up the west to settlement. For Alberta, those who were producers of beef and grain, the rail lines meant that national and international markets to access to markets. As you can see by this map, by the early 1900s, rail lines were extensive and acted as the transport truck and bus line of the day. There were several lines, CPR, CNR, CNAR, and other small lines, which could connect with the larger lines. All of these took a bite out of sending produce anywhere, adding up the substantial costs to the farm people. Earlier, in 1870, Ontario, which had been settled long before the West, a farm group called Patrons of Husbandry had been formed as a defense of the farmer against banks and the volatility of open markets. This group advocated cooperative trade, but banned political participation. In Ontario, getting produce to market was a struggle. Farmers in that province were dealing with elevators, rail lines, all of which were charging exorbitant fees. Many of the early Western Canadian families had come from Ontario and would have been familiar with that group. They would have noted how this group helped farmers deal with the marketing problems. While there were lots of rail lines, by 1901, all was not well down on the farm. Farmers were dealing with implement manufacturers and banks who had to be paid no matter what the price of grain was. Also, the farmers and the CPR with the grain traders were in conflict. To the residents of northern Alberta, CPR had let them down. The line had been originally planned to go through Edmonton, as Palliser decreed that the land in the south was not fit for farming. However, the CPR hired botanist John McCown, who said that there was land suitable for farming. The CPR decided to use the report to go south, where it could use the land granted to them and bypass the land in the north, which was established farmland and they would have had to pay for. Here are some examples of early grain elevators. To encourage grain traders to build elevators at gathering points, the CPR offered concessions to encourage anyone who wished to build an elevator. Private companies had a virtual monopoly on the purchase of grain. Agents offered cut-right prices on the elevator at the elevator and were instructed to increase margins by downgrading the quality, docking for weed seeds, and shorting the weight of grain. The farmers had little redress as there was no regulatory agency, no intervener, and no alternative. To add insult to injury, the Prime Minister was not sympathetic, leaving the farmers feeling victimized, as you can see by this cartoon. The Manitoba Grain Act was passed in 1901, designed to prevent abuses by grain dealers and railways and ensure fair practices and prices in the booming grain trade. There was a bumper crop that year, but farmers found they could not get their produce to market because the CPR and the grain companies were still failing to conform to the act. With all of these problems, farmers realized that they needed to organize, as it was recognized that there is strength in numbers. 1902, the Alberta Farmers Association was formed from an earlier Territorial Grain Growers Association to address and advocate for the ability to ship their grain at reasonable prices. There were a number of small farmer groups around the province. In 1904, the Farmers Association of Alberta, which had been formed at Lacombe, nominated a candidate from their group who ran for political office. His name was J.J. Gregory, and he lost. In 1905, Alberta became a province. Alexander Rutherford became the premier, and R.B. Bennett was the opposition leader. Chestermere was part of the Gleason riding, later called the Bow River riding, and Charles Stewart, a lawyer and a liberal, became the MLA. In 1906, the CPR, under the direction of William Pierce, developed an irrigation system with Reservoir Number 1, otherwise known as Chestermere Lake, as the western part. This played an important part in settlement and farming of southern Alberta. This is a whole other talk. In 1907, the Canadian Society of Equity was formed by immigrants from the American farming states such as the Dakotas. These were people who had experienced the American Society of Equity, which is an organization that was an agricultural cooperative. This group was formed to build and operate grain elevators, warehouses, mills, stockyards, and so on. It was also to buy and sell all manner of farmers' supplies. The object of the group was to control marketing, and buying and selling in bulk has always helped. One of the first things they bought was binder twine. The Alberta Farmers Association, with about 1,200 members, and the Canadian Society of Equity, with about 1,000 members, realized that individually they could not hope to be the influence that they would like to have, and that together they might be effective. So they agreed to meet in Edmonton in January 1909 and formed a new organization. The newly amalgamated group was called United Farmers of Alberta, and the motto was equity. The UFA interests were rural economic, social, and political. The UFA began as a nonpartisan organization whose aim was to be a lobby group promoting the interests of farmers in the province. This photo shows the farmers of both groups signing the agreement. If you will notice, they are dressed up. They had been told that they should have their best suits, starched shirts, and shiny boots, because if they dressed as if they were serious businessmen, they would be treated as such. The new organization was invited to attend the opening of the Alberta legislature. It was reported by the Edmonton Journal, quote, "They proceeded in line 4 abreast to the Ledge building, the march made brisker by the 30 below temperature," not unlike what it was this year. One of the first conventions of the joint group was held in Edmonton. In the following years, the convention alternated between Edmonton and Calgary. When UFA convention was held in Edmonton, it was held at First Presbyterian Church, which is located in downtown Edmonton, and as it is a historical building, it still exists. I have a connection to this building, as when UFA was holding meetings there, the minister in charge was Reverend David McQueen, my great-great-uncle. He was part of that church for 43 years before he retired. When UFA convention was held in Calgary, it was First Baptist Church, located across the street from the Sheldon Schumer Center. Like the church in Edmonton, it is a heritage building. Later conventions were held at the McDonald's Hotel in Edmonton, as the membership numbers exceeded what the churches could hold. In 1912, UFA moved into the brand new Lougheed building. The Lougheed building is another heritage building in Calgary and looks much the same today. There was residential space on the top floors, commercial retail space at street level, as well as access through the building to the Sherman Grand Theater. UFA occupied this space for many years and worked very closely with United Grain Growers. United Grain Growers was formed as a small group of prairie farmers who decided that the solution to their marketing problem lay in forming their own grain handling organization. Out of this arose the first farmer-owned and farmer-managed cooperative grain handling organization in Western Canada. They operated hundreds of country elevators and published various farm-oriented magazines, most notable of which is the Country Guide. I'm going to be showing you some photographs of the important people in this story. The first is Henry Wisewood, who was born in 1860 in the state of Missouri and bought a farm at Carstairs in 1905. He became active in organized farmers groups such as the Alberta Farmers of Alberta from the time he arrived in Alberta. Mr. Wood continued to play an important role in UFA until 1937, when he retired to his farm in Carstairs. He became president of UFA in 1916. He was deeply suspicious of politics and did not want UFA involved in what he considered divide and conquer attitudes of politicians. In 1914 to 1918, many of the young men going to battle were farmers or farmers' sons. Some did not come back. Some came back broken. And in many cases, the farming was being done by the women. In 1918, there was a grain shortage worldwide. In Europe, it was because it was the battlefield, and in Canada, because the labor force was in Europe. The Canadian government urged more grain growing. A bumper crop increased prices and costs. UFA passed resolutions calling for cheaper credit for farmers and protection of grain handling systems. William Irvin was born in Scotland and came to Alberta in 1916. He was not a farmer, but as a clergyman living among farmers, he seemed very interested in their lives. William helped convince United Farmers of Alberta to enter political life. The UFA was divided between those who supported direct political action and others, such as the leader, Mr. Wood, who wanted it to remain a farmer-led pressure group. Direct politics was endorsed, following a series of public debates between Irvin and Wood at UFA meetings. Mr. Wood was successful in restricting UFA's membership to farmers. Tony McPherson was born in Kansas in 1886 and moved to Alberta in 1906. He farmed a large, about 3,000 acre farm near Vulcan in southern Alberta and was elected to the riding of Little Bow. He acted as Speaker of the House from 1921 to 1926. The UFA convention in 1919 expressed a desire to move from influencing laws to making laws and passed a resolution to form a separate political arm, partly to protect the main organization's lobbying activities from being lost, and mainly to support candidates running in provincial and federal elections. The political arm was led by Tony McPherson. The group was formed because UFA members felt that liberals and conservative parties, federal and provincial, were not serving the interests of farmers. In 1919, Charles Fisher, who was a Liberal MLA for Cochrane, died in office, setting up a by-election. The UFA nominated Alexander Moore as a candidate. The election was called for the 3rd of November and was hotly contested. Mr. Moore won by a majority of 145 votes. It was also the heaviest turnout of voters ever to cast votes in that riding. The Calgary Herald called Henry Wood's statement "voicing Soviet doctrines and fostering class." There was some confusion about what it was that Mr. Moore actually stood for. What the rural voters recognized was that he was a farmer, so they voted his way. The Premier and 6 cabinet members, bringing in the heavy hitters, came to various forums to support their candidate. The newspapers of the area, the Albertan and the Calgary Herald, had lots to say about this election. I do not have time here, but if you want to read some interesting material, the old newspapers had a field day with this election. Charles Stewart, Premier and Liberal, called a provincial election for July 18, 1921, called in the shortest possible time, hoping to catch folk, read Conservatives, napping. This backfired, as the 1921 general election elected a UFA majority. It was one of only a few times that Alberta has changed governments. UFA won 38 of the 61 available seats, last year being the 100th anniversary of that election. Charles Mitchell, who was a lawyer and a Liberal, was elected for the Bow River riding. The newspapers called the UFA candidates, quote, crude, uneducated, inexperienced, but industrious and determined. The campaign was financed by $2 subscriptions and silver collections. The Liberal Party, which had governed the province since 1905, was defeated by the very new United Farmers of Alberta political party, which did not consider themselves a party. They were simply an agricultural lobby organization whose members were contesting their first general election. The United Farmers took most of the rural seats. The majority of votes in the constituents where UFA candidates ran went to UFA. Programs promised by the Liberal government but not delivered was used as ammo for the UFA campaign. Although the UFA won the election, they were unprepared to start administering the government. For one thing, none of the UFA members had any experience, some not even having set foot in the building. They did not even have a leader. Usually, a party chooses a leader before the election, but in their haste to organize and their odd not a party status, UFA was left leaderless. Henry Wisewood was the natural choice, but he wanted nothing to do with politics. And beside, he already had a job as president of the UFA. The man chosen was Herb Greenfield of Westlock. Herb Greenfield was born in England in 1869 and dropped out of school as a result of his father's bankruptcy. He then worked a cattle boat to Canada, settling briefly in Ontario before moving to Alberta to get a homestead near Westlock in 1904. He served as Premier of Alberta from 1921 to 1924. Then it was time to select a cabinet. Many of the winning candidates had other qualifications, such as Vernon Smith, who was a former railroad builder and was given the rail and telephone position. However, in a first for political parties, there was not a single lawyer in the caucus. The Attorney General's position needs legal experience. They turned to John Brownlee, who had been for many years UFA legal advisor. He agreed, but would need a by-election. John Brownlee was born in Ontario. After receiving his law degree, he moved to Calgary and joined the law firm of Lougheed, Bennett, Allison, and McLaws. He later went to work for another firm whose major client was UFA. He served as the UFA legal counsel from 1913 to become a UFA representative from 1921 to 1934, and as premier from 1925 to 1934. The fact that there needed to be 2 by-elections to form a government caused considerable furor, since one member would have to resign. The UFA was accused of backroom dealing, something they had as part of their platform to put an end to. They would also need ridings that would likely give the result they wanted. Irene Parlby was the first woman MLA. She was a lifelong advocate for rural Canadian women and children. She pushed to improve public health care services and establish municipal hospitals, as well as mobile medical and dental clinics. She was made a cabinet minister, the second woman in Canada to hold a provincial cabinet post. She was one of the famous 5. This is the cabinet. It was very small. Standing left to right, Alec Ross, Public Works, Richard Reed, Health, Perrin Baker, Education, Vernon Smith, Railways and Telephones, seated. Irene Parlby, Minister without portfolio. Herb Greenfield, Premier, and he also took the duties of Secretary Treasurer. John Brownlee, Attorney General. George Hoadley, Municipal Affairs and Agriculture. This is the entire 38-member party. The first session started with the usual pomp and ceremony. Herb Greenfield had selected Tony McPherson, UFA member for Little Bow, as Speaker. Selecting a Speaker is usually a formality and traditionally a unanimous vote. But a member from his own party arose from his seat to nominate a different member. Jaws dropped in the press box while the nominated party stood up and politely declined. This had greatly embarrassed the Premier. However, it exposed a lack of professionalism in the farmer members, one of whom reported to the press that, quote, "I object to the government asking members to merely act as rubber stamps," unquote. Later, in relation to a discussion about high schools in rural areas, a statement was made by a member in the legislative session, quote, "If I had my way, I would take 25% of the school trustees of Alberta and drown them like unwanted kittens," unquote. UFA members stated that they did not come to Parliament to be muzzled and were determined to speak their mind. These displays illustrated that the free spirit of members was going to be trouble and that there is a reason that parties require discipline. The backbenchers of the UFA were determined to speak their minds when the occasion occurred. This prompted rules that members were free to speak as they wished in caucus meetings, but were required to refrain from outbursts while the legislature was in session. The honeymoon was over when members of UFA locals began treating their new government like it was a favor factory. One plea for help was given by telegraph. Quote, "UFA stockyards completely destroyed by fire. Need $4,000 to rebuild at once. Wire reply." Unquote. The Premier must look after all of the citizens, but that was not the way some of the rural voters saw it. This produced a disconnect between the UFA government and the UFA organization. After the success of UFA in provincial politics, they turned to the federal scene. The 1921 Canadian federal election was held December 6, 1921. The Union government that had governed Canada through the First World War was defeated, replaced by a Liberal minority government under William Lyon Mackenzie King. A new third party, the Progressive Party, won the second most seats in the election. UFA won 2 seats. They were Ted Garland, a farmer from Rumsey, who won the Bow River riding, and William Irvin, clergyman, who won the East Calgary riding. There were 10 UFA candidates running. The issues were tariffs on agricultural implements, Crow freight rates, which had risen by 45%, and I understand might still be a problem, and the wheat board, grain farmers at the mercy of Winnipeg Grain Exchange. Ted Garland was quoted as saying, quote, Albertans will be encouraged to know they have at least representatives who are pleading their cause without fear of party or press, and who will not be silent while injustice still stands. In 1924, under pressure from the UFA, the government reinstated the Crow rate. Meanwhile, back at the farm, in the years 1921 to 1926, Alberta and the governing UFA faced drought in southern Alberta. For example, the Tilley area lost almost 6,500 farms and 16,700 people. 42 out of 55 schools closed. In 1922, $8 million was spent in drought relief. The 1922 Tax Recovery Act gave the farmers a better chance of staying on the farm. UFA conventions passed increasing calls for strong government measure to address the province's widespread poverty. On May 22nd of May 1924, prohibition was repealed. There was no way to keep a once legal substance out of the hands of those who want it. This was a problem for UFA, especially UFAW, as they had been very vocal in getting prohibition in the first place. After the murder of a provincial policeman, it was clear that things had to change. In a provincial referendum, the vote was to repeal prohibition. The 1926 general election was held the 28th of June, 1926. The writs of election were issued in May, allowing an election period of a full 40 days. Herb Greenfield had resigned as UFA party leader and premier in 1924, so John Brownlee accepted the position. 5 years after UFA's surprising win of the legislature, John Brownlee therefore needed reaffirmation from Albertans. The Greenfield era had not been kind to UFA, and the stumbles of the government were reflected in a drop in membership. What the new premier needed was some votes for a clear mandate to implement his plans. Predictably, the city newspapers went into attack mode. The Edmonton Bulletin stated UFA as being bankrupt of accomplishments. The Calgary Herald informed its readers of 3 choices: honest incapacity of the farmers, mismanagement of the Liberals, or the magnificent Conservative majority. The small town press, however, could separate the wheat from the chaff. Luckily, media do not decide elections. UFA won 43 out of 60 seats. Joseph Shaw, a Liberal, won for Bow River. Premier Brownlee enjoyed early success as a premier. He handily won the 1926 election, signed an agreement with the federal government, transferring control over Alberta's natural resources to its provincial government, sold struggling local railways to the CN and CP rail companies, ran a series of balanced budgets. Brownlee's government had by 1929 a $15 million nest egg. Things became more difficult with the Depression. So the government reluctantly ran deficit budgets and had a $5 million deficit by the end of the term. The 1930 general election was held June 19th. The United Farmers, led by John Brownlee, won the election to a 3rd term in government, UFA this time winning 39 seats. Joseph Shaw, who was now the leader of the Liberals, led his party to a disappointing 7 out of 61 seats. He was personally elected to the Bow River riding. The issues during this session were mainly the economy and how to keep it going. The 1935 general election was held on August 22nd, 1935. The newly founded Social Credit Party of Alberta, led by William Aberhart, won a huge victory, ending the 14-year government of the United Farmers of Alberta. Only one UFA candidate was elected. Premier John Brownlee had resigned a year earlier when he was sued and found liable for seduction of a young clerk working in the Attorney General's office. Although the verdict was immediately set aside by the presiding judge, the scandal seriously damaged UFA's reputation. Provincial Treasurer Richard Reid took the premier's position, but was unable to change the party's standings. After the loss in the election to Social Credit, the UFA political arm was disbanded and UFA concentrated on the Farmers Supply Group. The UFA did not field further candidates in any election. I've had fun in the research for this talk, so before I end, I would like to mention the sources. I used the book, Deep Roots, Promising Future, and it is an actual book, and an online history produced by the UFA in 2009 to celebrate 100 years. I've also used the first 50 years, which was produced by United Grain Growers to celebrate 50 years, Uniform, Conflict and Change, and Harvest Yet to Reap, plus all kinds of online services. And I understand that UFA has an online history, which is very interesting. Thank you very much for your interest in Alberta history.
Thank you, Kay. That was a great talk and very interesting. And really appreciate all the work you put into it. I'd like everyone to unmute if they'd like to ask some questions of Kay, or maybe I think there are some people who may have come, who have some experience with UFA, and they're more than welcome to speak up. We always like to have reactions to our programs.
I hope I've said the right thing. I see United Farmers historian is in the presence, so I hope I've done a good job of an overview.
You did. Oh, thank you very much, Kay. That was really great. Yeah, you did an excellent overview. So really great to see UFA history in one of the communities where there was a UFA presence. So thanks for that. I was glad that I found out about this. I hope you don't mind. I just put a link in the chat for people if they wanted to learn more about the Historical Society. And we also have an online searchable database where you can look for photos relating to UFA's time in government, but also before then and all the way up to the present. So we've got obviously a 100-year history of really great resources in our archives. And then Deep Roots that you mentioned, we actually have a fully digitized version on our website as well. So you can definitely have a look and peruse that too. So yeah, just wanted to say thanks and great job.
Thank you. I want to mention your Facebook page. I wish I'd seen it earlier. I probably would have added things to it if I had seen. So it's an excellent overview.
Oh, if you don't mind, if I could put in, I'll put in a link to our blog as well. So as you mentioned, last year was the 100th anniversary of the UFA government, and I did a huge blog post / virtual exhibit to celebrate this history, and I used all resources from our archives to showcase this point in history. But if you don't mind, if I could pop that into the chat too, and there's lots of pictures and things like that, but you did a wonderful overview of the history. It's a lot of history to cover in a short amount of time, and even when I was writing it, I wanted to keep a concise blog article, and I think I was up to 3,000-4,000 words because there was just so much within that 15-year history that could be included, and I didn't even include everything. So it's a big topic.
Can I ask your name, the lady that's the United Farmers Historical Society? Maybe you could put it in the chat.
Sure.
Your name and your position.
You bet. My name is Erin Orr, and I'll put it in the chat just because the spelling's not always what you think it is. And I'm the archivist for the United Farmers Historical Society. And I've been in this position for about 2 years now. I started right as the pandemic was starting. So it's a very interesting time to start a new position. But the Historical Society actually goes back about 20 years. And so it's been in existence for a couple decades now, and I've had different archivists in, and just trying to do a lot of work to reach communities and bring awareness to the resources that we can provide, and also the material and knowledge that we can provide people as well.
Thank you. I'm having a great deal of difficult hearing you, so I did not catch your name, and if you could just put it into the chat so that I've got the spelling correct and everything for the minutes. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Erin. That's wonderful information, and we've got it in the chat, so we'll have that. And we really appreciate you coming today, and also for the kudos that you gave to Kay. Were there any other people who were involved locally, or whose family members were involved with the UFA who are online who might like to make some comments? You can just unmute.
There was a very active chapter in this area. A very active chapter of the UFA in this area was the Conrich branch, but people from Chestermere and in this district attended it, and they were very active.
I realized that I mentioned in the talk, I think, that 3 generations of my family were, well, it's more than 3. My grandfather, my father, my brother, my daughter, my granddaughter are all AUFA members. So 5 generations in this family.
Well, I'll just, oh, did you want to say something, Matt?
Sure. I was going to thank you. I can take my video off. I didn't clean up for the event or anything. I'm just at home here, but I wanted to thank you, Kay, and thank you for your society of putting this on. I thought it was a really great presentation, and our families goes way back with UFA as well. You know, we certainly didn't run. One of my great uncles was the Speaker of the House, but not with UFA though. But we've been members since it started, I guess, and our family started farming here in the Acme area in 1903, and we continue to actively farm now. And then I started out with UFA as a delegate, and now I'm a director with UFA. So I certainly enjoyed the presentation, and I enjoy being involved in UFA with UFA in that capacity as well. And we also have Joe Van Vavel. He's also on the line here. I think I scrolled through and saw his name there. So he's a longtime delegate and as well, but I'll let Joe speak for himself if he wishes. But I'd like to thank you for your presentation today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm glad we really were lucky to contact the Rocky View newspaper and have an article there. So it really broadened our reach out to people in the farming area outside of Chestermere. So thank you so much for coming. I see Joe's unmuted, so I think he's going to say something maybe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks too. Yes, like Matt said, I've been a delegate for a few years here now, 13 I think. My dad was a former delegate and director with UFA. We're from the Strathmore area. So it's nice to see people taking interest, because history is always interesting, and if it's not kept, it's lost. So I thank you very much and appreciate what you guys did.
Oh, you're welcome.
Good. Well, I don't want to cut anyone else off. If there's anyone else who wanted to have something to say about UFA or the presentation, we'll wait a few more minutes.
A wonderful presentation. I wasn't able to find Aunt Eva's letter or her notes for trying to get a co-op started in one of the other communities. So I don't know what I did with it, but I was told that she worked for Henry Weiswood as the secretary for a while.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's great. And I just wanted to say to Joe, when I saw the name Van Bavel, my last name was Morgan. I lived east of Strathmore, so you wouldn't recognize the name I have now. But I just was kind of pleased to see some people from out that way on the program today.
Yes, it's a small world.
Yeah, it is. Some of us don't move too far from home. Okay, well, I think we'll bring this to a close and just say once again, thank you so much, Kay. We, in Chestermere here, we have a huge urban population, but we always want to remember that our roots were that this was a farming community. So we appreciate Kay bringing this program, and all of the programs that we have, we like to always have a bit of a look back at the farming history around Chestermere. So thank you very much. I'm going to end the program and the recording, and just say thank you again, and hope that you will come and join in another time if programs are of interest. Thank you so much.